Forget the towers. Forget the heavy silk dresses and the silent weeping princesses waiting for a knight. That is a lie. A romantic fairy tale sold to you by 19th century historians who wanted to keep their wives in the kitchen and their daughters away from boardrooms. They projected their own repression back onto the Middle Ages, creating a false past to justify their present. But what if I told you the records tell a different story? A story of power, rebellion, and a freedom that was stolen from their granddaughters centuries later. What if I told you that in the year 1297, a woman could own a multinational shipping fleet, sue a man in high court and win, and manage an entire financial empire while her husband was 500 miles away? What if I told you that a woman in the so-called Dark Ages had more legal autonomy than an American or British woman in the 1950s? Tonight, we shatter the glass ceiling of the past. Welcome to the real Middle Ages. Welcome to the Empire of the Silent. Look at this image. A woman in 1955 in New York. She is bright, educated, and completely dependent. She needs her husband's signature to open a bank account. She can't serve on a jury in many states. She is, legally, a shadow. She is femme covert, her legal existence covered by her husband. Now let's rewind 700 years. This isn't just about small exceptions. This is about the system. Medieval European society, despite all its harshness, was surprisingly pragmatic. When a man went off to war or to crusade or on a long trading journey, someone had to manage the estate, the cash flow, the castle, and the law. That someone was almost always his wife, his mother, or his sister. And the law recognized this reality. Medieval court records from France and England, preserved for centuries, use a powerful Latin phrase, femme sole, a single, independent woman. This was a legal status that gave a woman the same rights as a man in the eyes of the law. And crucially, a married woman could achieve femme sole status for the purpose of running her own business. T means they didn't need their husband's permission to open a ledger or sign a contract. They weren't a shadow, they were the CEO. Meet Alice de Brienne. It's 1297 in England. Alice isn't waiting in a tower. She is commanding a business empire from her boardroom. Records from the British Library, analyzed by historian Pamela Nightingale, show Alice negotiating not for silk dresses, but for an entire fleet of trading ships. She was buying vessels capable of crossing the North Sea and the Mediterranean. Imagine Alice, a vilain dai that lung de treo chia kua, keys of authority, ao chuang nhung ruk ro, huang dan han vat. She stands at the docks, watching her ships load with wool and spices. She is calculating profit margins and evaluating risk, not spinning thread in silence. Alice was the CEO of a 13th century logistics giant, managing cash flow that would dwarf modern venture funds. And she wasn't an anomaly. The markets of London, Paris, and Florence were battlegrounds, and women were the generals. Medieval guild records, the equivalent of modern chambers of commerce, tell a story that would make a Harvard MBA blush. In 14th century Paris, according to tax records analyzed by historian David Herlihy, women didn't just participate in guilds, they dominated entire industries entirely. They were the maîtresses, master artisans, in gold thread making, silk weaving, and spice importing. They wasn't just helpers to their husbands, they held voting rights in their guilds equal to any man. They had the legal power to hire, fire, and set market prices. But then, the Great Erasure began. The very success that gave these women power also made powerful men incredibly nervous. And in the archives, we found evidence of a systematic campaign to overwrite their reality. As we approach the end of the Middle Ages, as universities become more formalized and male-dominated, and as governments centralize, we see the laws begin to shift. The very rights that allowed women to manage businesses and serve as legal entities are systematically stripped away, piece by piece. Tea wasn't a slow progression. It was a coup. Why did it happen? Because medieval women were too effective. They didn't just dominate business. They understood how to wield the law. In an era where we assume might made right, medieval women were litigation warriors. They didn't retreat in the face of injustice. They filed lawsuits. Court records from medieval France and England show thousands of cases of women appearing as independent legal entities. They sued for property rights, contractual disputes, and, most surprisingly, for justice against violence. Remember Marjorie Kempe? Not just the mystic, but a successful businesswoman who used her autobiography, the first written in English, to document not her prayers, but her complex business negotiations and her strategies for achieving financial and social independence. Kempe wasn't fighting against expectation. She was fulfilling the medieval expectation of a woman who contributed economically to her family and community. Or consider Agnes de Montfort in 1314 England. Faced with a feudal lord attempting to enforce the notorious right of the first night, a brutal myth of sexual dominance, Agnes didn't just cry. She didn't hide in silence. She sued him for sexual assault in a high public court. And the most incredible part? She won. The court records preserved in the English National Archives show Agnes arguing her case with the skill of a trained lawyer, citing precedent and church law. The lord was fined heavily, and the practice was officially banned in her region. Agnes didn't wait for a hero. She wielded the law like a weapon. The Dark Ages were only dark because we were told to close our eyes. These women were the original disruptors, the first entrepreneurs, the architects of a freedom that would be stolen from their granddaughters centuries later. They proved that independent legal entities, business leadership, and the quest for justice were not modern achievements. They were medieval realities for women who had the courage to claim them. In our next part, we're going deep into the boardroom itself. You'll meet the woman who essentially invented international banking and the alewives, the female brewers who ran the most dangerous and profitable business monopoly in Europe. They were savage negotiators, and you won't want to miss their strategies. Which part of this shattered your reality the most? The bank accounts, the international logistics fleets, or the high court cases won against feudal lords? Drop a comment below. I read every single one. And if you're ready to reclaim the truth and support this forgotten empire, hit that subscribe button. The empire is waking up. Imagine a world where the most profitable industry, one that everyone, from peasants to kings, consumed every single day, was owned, operated, and controlled entirely by women. No glass ceilings, no male middle managers, just a total, undisputed monopoly. This wasn't a feminist utopia. This was 14th century London and Paris. While history books focus on kings fighting for dirt, a silent army of women was fighting for markets. Today, we're stepping into the high-stakes world of medieval female entrepreneurs. From the woman who managed an international shipping fleet to the alewives who ran a beer empire so powerful that men had to call them witches just to steal their market share. #Body Content. Part 1. The Lady of the Fleet. Let's talk about Alice de Brienne. If she were alive today, she'd be on the cover of Forbes. Alice didn't just inherit land, she managed logistics. In the late 13th century, wool was England's white gold. It was the oil of the Middle Ages, and Alice was one of its biggest players. Archival records from the Counts of Brienne and English customs accounts reveal something startling. Alice was purchasing and managing a fleet of merchant ships. We aren't talking about small fishing boats. These were cogs, massive deep-hulled vessels designed for international trade. Picture Alice. She isn't in a parlor. She's at the docks of Ipswich. She's checking the quality of English wool destined for the looms of Flanders and Italy. She's calculating lay days, the time a ship spends loading, because in 1300, just like in 2026, time was money. Alice was a feme sole merchant. She held her own seal, signed her own contracts, and managed a network of agents across the English Channel. She understood global supply chains 700 years before the term was even invented. But if Alice ran the seas, another group of women ran the streets. Meet the alewives. In medieval Europe, water was often deadly. Ale was food. It was medicine. It was the only safe thing to drink. And for centuries, brewing was women's work. It was a domestic skill scaled up into a commercial powerhouse. By the 1300s, women, often called brewsters, held a near-total monopoly on the ale market. In Oxford alone, records show one alehouse for every 142 inhabitants, and almost all were run by women. They were the original girl bosses. They had their own income, their own property, and they answered to no one. They wore tall, pointed hats so they could be spotted in crowded markets. They kept cats to protect their grain from rats. They stirred bubbling cauldrons of fermenting liquid. Does that image sound familiar? Here is the dark twist of economic history. By the late 15th century, brewing became big business. Men saw the massive profit margins, and they wanted in. But they couldn't just outbrew the women. The women were too good. So, they used the ultimate weapon: reputation. They took the symbols of the professional alewife, the tall hat, the cat, the cauldron, and they rebranded them as the symbols of the witch. They started a smear campaign. They claimed that women brewing alone were consorting with the devil. They passed laws, like in Chester in 1540, banning women between 14 and 40 from selling ale, claiming they were immoral. It wasn't a religious crusade, it was a corporate hostile takeover. By turning the brewster into a witch, men successfully pushed women out of the most lucrative industry in Europe and seized the monopoly for themselves. How did these women survive when the guilds started to close their doors? They went underground. They created shadow financial networks. Historian Catherine Ryerson discovered records of women like Agnes de Bossones, a real estate mogul in Montpellier. After her husband died, Agnes didn't just sit on her wealth. She became a venture capitalist for other women. She created topographic clusters of property, renting rooms specifically to lower-class women to help them start their own trades. She provided nest eggs, informal loans that didn't appear in official male-led bank ledgers. In London, widows like Rose de Burford were among the greatest wool merchants in the city's history. They navigated admiralty courts and won lawsuits against male lenders who tried to cheat them. They used their informal capital to fund the next generation of female artisans, creating a cycle of wealth that the official patriarchy couldn't touch. Alice de Brienne and the alewives prove one thing: medieval women weren't victims of the economy. They were the economy. They were innovators, risk-takers, and survivors who only lost their power when men used fear and mythology to steal what they couldn't win in a fair market. The witch you see in movies today? She's not a monster. She's a successful businesswoman whose empire was stolen. In part 3, we're leaving the marketplace and heading to the battlefield. You'll meet the pregnant commander who terrified emperors and the women who turned the Crusades into their own personal chess match. But first, knowing that the witch image was actually a corporate smear campaign, how does that change the way you see history? Tell me in the comments. And if you think these women deserve to have their boardrooms back, hit that subscribe button. We are taught that the Middle Ages was a man's game, a game of steel, blood, and brute force. We are told that women were the prizes to be won, the damsels to be rescued, or the silent mourners in the aftermath. Burn those storybooks. In the real 11th century, the most feared military commander in Europe wasn't a king or a duke. It was a woman who spent 30 years in the saddle, humiliated emperors, and rewritten the borders of Italy with the edge of her mind and the tip of her lance. Today, we meet the lions of the battlefield. These are the women who didn't just survive war, they mastered it. Meet Matilda of Tuscany. To her enemies, she was the daughter of Peter. To her soldiers, she was the great countess. To the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, she was a living nightmare. Matilda's power wasn't just inherited, it was forged in the fires of the investiture controversy, the greatest power struggle of the Middle Ages. When the emperor tried to seize her Italian territories, Matilda didn't retreat to a convent. She mobilized. Picture Matilda. Visual. Giap Loi Ksham, Ao Chuang, Joruk, Koin Gua Chien, Huang Dan Han Vat. She was a master of asymmetric warfare. She knew she couldn't match the emperor's heavy cavalry in a flat field, so she turned the Apennine Mountains into a death trap. In the winter of 1077, at the castle of Canossa, Matilda orchestrated one of the greatest political humiliations in history. She didn't fire a single arrow. She simply closed the gates. She forced the most powerful man in Christendom to stand outside in the freezing snow, barefoot, dressed as a penitent, for 3 days and 3 nights, begging for entry. Matilda wasn't just holding a castle, she was holding the strings of European politics. She proved that a woman with a fortress and a cold stare could bring an empire to its knees. For 30 years, she commanded armies, directed sieges, and remained the primary military ally of the papacy. She died with her sword in its scabbard, but her borders remained untouched. While Matilda held the south, Eleanor of Aquitaine was taking the fight to the east. In 1147, the Second Crusade was launched. Eleanor didn't stay behind to manage the accounts. She took the cross herself. She arrived in Constantinople not as a companion, but as a sovereign leader with her own army of Aquitanian vassals. The legend says, Eleanor led a troop of noblewomen dressed as Amazons, white tunics, red crosses, riding astride like men. While historians debate the outfits, the military records show her influence was undeniable. At the Battle of Mount Cadmus, the French army faced disaster. The male commanders, including King Louis VII, made a fatal error. They separated the vanguard from the rearguard. Eleanor, leading the vanguard, reached the summit and saw the strategic advantage. She urged the army to move faster. The king hesitated. The result? The rearguard was massacred by Turkish forces. Eleanor was blamed by the court, but the survivors knew the truth. If they had followed the queen's pace, they would have lived. Eleanor learned a hard lesson that day. On the battlefield, the only thing more dangerous than an enemy is a slow ally. She spent the rest of the crusade navigating the treacherous diplomacy of Antioch, proving she was a better statesman than any general in the camp. But the real terror for invading armies didn't always come from queens on horseback. It came from the ladies of the keep. In the Middle Ages, a siege was a psychological war of attrition, and women were the masters of the long game. Meet Nicola de la Haye. In 1217, at the age of 60, she was the castellan of Lincoln Castle. While a rebel army and French mercenaries hammered at her gates, Nicola didn't panic. She didn't wait for a knight in shining armor. She climbed the battlements herself. She managed the sappers, the teams digging counter tunnels to stop the enemy from undermining the walls. She coordinated the boiling hordes, defensive structures used to drop stones and oil on attackers. When the royalist army finally arrived to relieve the siege, they didn't find a broken woman. They found a fortress that had held firm for months because one woman refused to blink. Then there was Black Agnes of Dunbar. When the Earl of Salisbury besieged her castle in 1338, he brought the latest siege engines. Agnes watched the massive rocks smash against her walls. Her response? She sent her maids out in their finest silk dresses to dust off the impact sites with white handkerchiefs. It was the ultimate flex. She was telling the English army, "Your best weapons are a mere inconvenience to my housekeeping." After 6 months of being mocked, Salisbury retreated, famously saying, "Came I early, came I late, I found Agnes at the gate." These women, Matilda, Eleanor, Nicola, and Agnes, shattered the myth of female fragility. They didn't just help in the war effort. They were the strategic backbone of their nations. They used psychological warfare, logistics, and raw courage to defend their legacies when the men around them failed. They remind us that in the Middle Ages, the warrior wasn't just the one holding the sword, it was the one holding the gate. In our next part, we transition from the blood of the ramparts to the secrets of the body. You'll meet Trotula of Salerno, the woman who ran a secret medical school and wrote the Bible of women's health that remained the gold standard for 400 years. But first, who would you want defending your castle? The strategic Iron Countess or the mocking Black Agnes? Let me know in the comments. And if you're ready to see the Dark Ages in a whole new light, hit that subscribe button. For 1,000 years, we've been told the Dark Ages were a time of medical ignorance, where doctors used only prayers and leeches. But while the great cathedrals were being built, a secret revolution was happening in the sunlight of southern Italy. In the city of Salerno, women weren't just patients. They were the professors. They were the surgeons. They were the original biohackers. Meet Trotula of Salerno. She didn't just help with births. She wrote the blueprint for human biology that would be used for 400 years. She was so advanced that centuries later, a group of male scholars tried to delete her from history, claiming a woman couldn't possibly possess such divine intelligence. Today, we uncover the forbidden laboratory of the medicine queens. In the year 1050, if you wanted to survive a disease, you didn't go to Paris or London. You went to Salerno. Salerno was the Silicon Valley of medieval medicine, a melting pot where Arabic alchemy, Greek anatomy, and Latin pragmatism collided. At the center of this intellectual storm were the Mulieres Salernitanae, the women of Salerno, and their leader was Trotula. Picture Trotula. Visual. Ao chuang toi mau. Tai kam thao duok. An matsaksao. Huang dan han vat. She wasn't just a midwife. She was a magistra, a master professor in the world's most prestigious medical department. She didn't just guess. She experimented. Her magnum opus, the Trotula, wasn't a book of spells. It was a rigorous clinical text. She was the first to realize that women's health wasn't just men's health in a smaller body. She identified unique hormonal cycles, and in a move that would shock the patriarchal world, she was the first to suggest that infertility could be caused by the male, not just the female. In 1050, that wasn't just science, it was a social earthquake. Let's get into the technical. Trotula's laboratory was a place of high-stakes chemistry. While the church argued that women were designed to suffer during childbirth as punishment for Eve's sin, Trotula had a different philosophy. Suffering is an obstacle to healing. She developed what we can call the first medieval epidural. She combined opium, mandrake root, and hemlock into a botanical anesthetic. She taught her students how to induce a deep sleep so they could perform complex internal surgeries, specifically to repair obstetric fistulas. This was surgery so precise it used silk threads for sutures, centuries before modern surgeons rediscovered the technique. But Trotula didn't stop at surgery. She was a pioneer of holistic wellness. She wrote the first treatise on cosmetics, but don't let the name fool you. This was dermatology. She understood that skin was an indicator of internal health. She created recipes for lead-free face powders, scalp treatments for hair loss, and balms for eczema using honey, rose oil, and zinc. She taught women that hygiene was power. In an age where we assume everyone was dirty, Trotula's Salerno diet and hygiene protocols kept the noblewomen of Europe vibrant, healthy, and, crucially, alive. But knowledge is dangerous when it belongs to the wrong gender. By the 15th century, the medical market was changing. Male-only universities were rising. To control the market, male doctors had to eliminate the competition. They couldn't outperform the women of Salerno, so they decided to erase them. In 1566, a male editor named Hans Caspar Wolff took Trotula's masterpieces and changed the name. He claimed the author was a man named Trotus. He argued that no woman could understand the complexities of the human body or the chemistry of anesthetics. For the next 400 years, Trotula was officially erased from the medical canon. Her life's work was attributed to a man who didn't exist, but you can't kill a legacy that is literally carved into the lives of millions. Beyond the formal halls of Salerno, Trotula's knowledge flowed into the shadow networks. These were the wise women, the village healers, who were the actual general practitioners of the Middle Ages. While the rich paid male doctors to bleed them with leeches, the poor went to the woman with the herbs. These healers managed the health of entire communities. They knew how to stop a hemorrhage with willow bark, which we now know contains the precursor to aspirin. They knew how to treat infections with moldy bread, the original penicillin. They were scientists operating without a license. By the late 1400s, this competition became a threat to the male medical guild's monopoly. The line between doctor and witch wasn't drawn by theology, it was drawn by economics. If you were a woman who could heal without a university degree, you weren't a scientist. You were a sorceress. The witch trials were, in many ways, the bloodiest corporate takeover in history. Trotula of Salerno and her medicine queens prove that women have always been the guardians of life and science. They didn't just discover medicine, they practiced it under the threat of fire and erasure. The next time you open a medicine cabinet, remember the women of Salerno. Remember the Chilua team and the mandrake root. In our next part, we leave the laboratory and enter the high court. You'll meet the law warriors, women who used the legal system to sue kings, secure their fortunes, and win back their children in an era we thought they had no rights. But first, knowing that witch was often a label for unlicensed doctor. How does that change your view of the Salem trials or European folklore? Tell me in the comments. And if you're ready to reclaim our forbidden history, hit that subscribe button. We've been told that in the Middle Ages, a woman's word was worthless, that she was a silent shadow, legally invisible, with no voice in the halls of justice. But the Parlement de Paris archives contain a document from 1386 that shatters that myth. It is the record of a woman who did the unthinkable. She didn't just accuse a powerful man of a crime. She forced the entire legal system of France to grind to a halt. She played a high-stakes game of legal chicken, where the price of losing wasn't just a fine. It was the stake. Today, we meet the law warriors. This isn't just about laws. It's about the raw, lethal power of a woman's testimony. Meet Marguerite de Carouge. In 1386, she was a noblewoman in Normandy. While her husband was away, she was attacked and raped by Jacques Legris, a favorite of the Count. In most eras, this would be a dead end. But Marguerite knew the law. She didn't just whisper her trauma to a priest. She made a public appeal of felony. This was a specific legal move that bypassed local lords and went straight to the king's court. Marguerite understood that in the 14th century, rape wasn't just a moral sin. It was a crime of violence against the crown's peace. By framing it this way, she forced the highest judges in France to hear her voice. The trial in Paris was a masterclass in medieval litigation. Jacques Legris had an alibi, powerful friends, and the best lawyers money could buy. He tried to dismiss Marguerite's testimony by claiming she was hysterical or confused. But Margaret didn't blink. She used a rare and terrifying legal loophole, the judicial duel. She argued that because there were no witnesses, the only way to find the truth was trial by combat. This wasn't just a fight. It was a legal procedure where God was the judge. But here was the catch. If her champion, her husband, lost, the law dictated that Marguerite had committed perjury. The penalty? She would be burned alive at the stake immediately after the duel. Margaret was betting her life on the truth of her words. She spent months in the Parlement, being interrogated by dozens of male judges. She had to recount every detail of the assault, over and over, under the threat of fire. She never changed her story. She used the consistency of testimony, a core principle of modern law, to win over the skeptical judges. They granted the duel, the last of its kind in French history. While her husband fought on the field, Marguerite sat on a scaffold dressed in black, watching the legal outcome of her own life. When the duel ended in her favor, it wasn't just a military victory. It was a legal precedent. Marguerite's case proved that a woman's testimony, when consistent and corroborated by circumstantial evidence, could overrule the word of a powerful man. But the law warriors weren't just in Paris. Across the English Channel, women were mastering the writ of right. Meet Nicolas de la Haye, the legal version. When the king tried to strip her of her hereditary title as sheriff, Nicola didn't just raise an army. She raised a bill of complaint. She argued that her tenure was protected by the Charter of Liberties. She was using the same legal DNA that would eventually become the Magna Carta. Nicola filed injunctions to stop the king's men from entering her lands. Ba argued that as a femme sole, she held her office in fee, meaning it was her property, not the king's, to take. She won her case through a relentless paper trail that lasted 3 decades. She died as a sheriff, a landowner, and a legal legend. But there was one court where women had a secret advantage: the ecclesiastical courts. In these church courts, women filed for separation of bed and board. This was the medieval no-fault divorce. If a woman could prove her husband was wasting the dowry or being unreasonably cruel, the church would grant her a legal separation and control over her own assets. We found records of a woman named Alice in 1320 who sued her husband because he sold her favorite cow without asking. She argued it violated their marriage contract. The court agreed. They didn't just give her back the cow, they gave her legal control over the entire farm's income. The law warriors proved that medieval women were litigious, savvy, and fearless. They didn't just live under the law, they lived by the law. They understood that a well-placed writ could be more powerful than 1,000 knights. They weren't objects to be owned, they were litigants to be feared. In our next part, we move from the cold courtroom to the ruck row silk wardrobe. You'll meet the fashion generals, women who used silk, pearls, and dyes as a form of high-stakes political branding. But first, knowing that Margaret bet her life on being believed, what do you think was her greatest weapon? Her husband's sword or her own unwavering testimony? Tell me in the comments. And if you're ready to reclaim the real power of the past, hit that subscribe button. We are told that fashion is shallow, that obsessed with silk and jewels is a sign of a weak, vain mind. But in the year 1390, at the royal court of France, a dress was never just a dress. It was a manifesto. It was a weapon of mass intimidation. It was a social execution designed to bankrupt a rival's reputation before they even reached the throne. Today, we enter the rook-row and ruthless world of the fashion generals. This is the story of the silk coup, a war fought with needles instead of swords, where the wrong shade of velvet could lead to a charge of witchcraft. Welcome to the original art of power branding. Imagine the year 1389. Isabeau of Bavaria is preparing for her grand entry into Paris. She isn't just a queen, she is a brand. She appeared in a gown so heavy with gold thread and jewels that she required 2 knights just to help her stand. The inventory records from the Archives Nationales reveal the nuclear option of fashion. 2,477 pearls, hundreds of sapphires, and a fabric so rare it took Italian looms 2 years to weave. This wasn't vanity. This was financial intimidation. By wearing a literal kingdom on her back, Isabeau was sending a message to the rebellious French dukes. My resources are infinite. I am not a guest. I am the empire. She used visual dominance to establish her authority. In a world where 90% of the population was illiterate, her dress was a 4K broadcast of her absolute power. But every queen has a rival. Enter Valentina Visconti, the Duchess of Orléans. Valentina brought with her the sophisticated avant-garde styles of Milan, the fashion capital of the world. The court became a battlefield. Valentina pioneered a style called the Italian cut, fitted sleeves, deep necklines, and a subtle use of black silk, which was harder to achieve than bright colors. It was the 14th century version of quiet luxury. It made Isabeau's heavy gold look old money and clunky. Isabeau struck back using the law. She influenced the king to pass sumptuary laws specifically designed to bankrupt Valentina's wardrobe. She made it illegal for anyone except the queen to use specific types of ermine fur or certain heights of the hennin, the tall conical hat. But the war went darker. When the king fell into bouts of madness, Isabeau used Valentina's superior fashion against her. She whispered that Valentina's dresses weren't just beautiful, they were enchanted. She claimed the Italian silks were woven with spells to steal the king's mind. The fashion war ended in a social assassination. Valentina, the most stylish woman in France, was accused of witchcraft and exiled. Her wardrobe was confiscated. Isabeau didn't need a dagger. She used a silk thread to garrote her rival's life. Why were these women so obsessed with height? The hennin was the power suit of the 1400s. These hats grew to be 3 feet tall. They were architectural statements. A woman in a hennin didn't just walk into a room. She commanded the airspace. She forced everyone, including the men, to look up at her. It was a physical manifestation of high status. Behind these fashion generals was a secret army, the master embroiderers. In Paris, these were almost entirely women. They were the creative directors of the era. They understood coded branding. They would embroider secret symbols into the hems of dresses, a specific flower, a particular knot. To a man, it was just a pattern. To another woman, it was a LinkedIn profile. It communicated political alliances, wealth levels, and family loyalty. They were the original masters of the hidden signal. But what happens when the money runs out? In our next part, we leave the Ruckrow wardrobe and go into the shadows of the nest eggs. You'll meet the financial masterminds, women who built an underground banking system to fund wars, buy their children's safety, and run entire countries while the men were busy fighting over titles. The fashion generals prove that appearance was never just appearance. It was a sophisticated system of psychological warfare and political branding. Isabeau and Valentina didn't just follow trends, they used them as weapons. They understood that in the game of power, the one who controls the visual narrative controls the world. So, if you were at the French court in 1390, would you wear Isabeau's pearl armor for raw dominance, or Valentina's Milanese silk for subtle, dangerous sophistication? Tell me your power brand in the comments. And if you're ready to see the real money behind the silk, hit that subscribe button. In the 14th century, a woman officially owned nothing. Her dowry, her inheritance, even her clothes belonged to her husband under the law of coverture. But if you looked into the secret compartments of a merchant's wife's jewelry box, you wouldn't find vanity. You would find a hedge fund. While kings were begging for high-interest loans from Italian bankers, a silent army of women was running a multi-million-dollar underground credit union. They didn't just save money. They laundered power through silk, pearls, and liquid gold. Today, we uncover the financial masterminds of the Middle Ages. These were the women who essentially invented modern venture capital from their private chambers. To a man in 1350, a woman's jewelry was just adornment. To a woman, it was a collateralized asset. Because liquid cash was easily seized by tax collectors or husbands, medieval women invested their wealth in portable assets. A heavy gold chain or a brooch encrusted with sapphires served as a 14th century offshore account. These items were highly standardized in value across Europe. A woman could take a ruby ring from London to Paris and liquidate it at a local goldsmith for immediate cash to fund a business deal or hire a lawyer. This was money laundering at its finest. By converting land or grain into jewelry, they moved their wealth into a shadow space that male-led courts couldn't track. But individual wealth was just the beginning. The real power was in the Beguine financial networks. The Beguines, Huang Dan Han Vat, Ao Chuang Toi Mao, Tai Kam So Kai Dai, Huang Dan Han Vat, were the freelancers of the Middle Ages. They chose not to marry, which meant they maintained their legal status as femmes sole, individuals who could sign contracts. They turned their communal houses into shadow banks. Records from Flanders show beguine houses managing investment portfolios for local widows. They would pool thousands of small nest eggs to provide massive loans for the international cloth trade. They were essentially the first crowdfunders. They bypassed the male-only banks and created a circular economy. Women's capital funding women's businesses with interest rates that undercut the Medici and the Fuggers. Meet Alice de Brienne, the financial strategist. Her household accounts from 1412 are a masterpiece of coded accounting. Alice didn't just record income and expenses. She used a system of double-entry bookkeeping combined with secret symbols. A specific embroidery pattern on a receipt might signify a bill of exchange, a primitive form of a check that could be redeemed in Flanders. She used her shipping fleet, remember TAP 2, to move this shadow capital across borders. While the English king was desperate for cash to fund the 100 Years' War, Alice was quietly moving thousands of gold florins to support female-led guilds in Italy. She understood risk diversification 500 years before it became a buzzword. She held assets in wool, in ships, and in the liquid gold of her inner circle. But what happens when the men try to seize the nest eggs? In 1450, the London guilds tried to ban women from direct investment. They claimed it was a threat to social order. The women's response wasn't a protest. It was a financial strike. They coordinated through their shadow networks and simultaneously withdrew all their informal credit from male merchants. The London market froze. Ships couldn't be loaded. Artisans couldn't buy raw materials. The men realized too late that their official economy was built on a foundation of female liquidity. The ban was lifted within 6 weeks. The shadow masterminds had won. The financial masterminds prove that money is the ultimate disruptor of the patriarchy. These women understood that true independence isn't a right, it's an asset. They built a parallel world where they were the bankers, the investors, and the winners. The next time you hear the term nest egg, remember the coded ledgers and the ruby brooches. It wasn't about saving for a rainy day. It was about funding a revolution in the dark. In our next part, we move from the mat that of finance to the secret laboratories of the 2VN. You'll meet the rebel scholars, nuns who were conducting scientific experiments and preserving the world's knowledge while the men were busy burning it. But first, if you were a medieval woman, would you put your wealth in a heavy gold chain for portability or a beguine investment fund for long-term growth? Let me know your strategy in the comments. And if you're ready to follow the real money, hit that subscribe button. In the year 1150, a woman's body was a battlefield. It was a contract signed in blood, a piece of land to be traded, and a vessel for heirs. But inside the stone walls of the great halls, a group of women decided to flip the script. They didn't use swords. They used encryption. They invented a game so powerful that it turned their husbands' most loyal knights into their personal secret servants. Today, we enter the world of forbidden love. This isn't a fairy tale. This is the story of how medieval women hacked the patriarchy through the art of the coded desire. Before the 12th century, love was considered a dangerous distraction. Then came Eleanor of Aquitaine and her daughter, Marie de Champagne. They realized that if they couldn't change the laws of property, they would change the laws of the heart. They sponsored the troubadours, the rock stars of the Middle Ages. But there was a professional requirement. The poets only got paid if they sang songs where the woman was the suzerain, the boss, and the man was the vassal, the servant. This was the birth of courtly love. It wasn't about finding the one. It was about social engineering. By making romantic devotion the highest noble virtue, women gained a psychological remote control over the very men who officially owned them. How did they communicate in a castle full of spies? They didn't use parchment that could be intercepted. They used the language of objects. Imagine a lady giving a knight a favor, a simple silk sleeve or a hand-stitched ribbon to wear in a tournament. To her husband, it was a gesture of polite encouragement. But to the knight, it was a coded message. The number of knots in the silk, the specific color of the thread, remember the War of Colors from tab 6, and the direction of the embroidery stitches were all part of a complex cipher. 3 blue knots meant the garden gate at midnight. A gold thread sewn in a zigzag meant my husband's spies are watching, stay away. They were sending encrypted DMs 800 years before the internet. We found a record of a woman named Beatrice who teyu a specific pattern of birds onto a tapestry. To the world, it was art. To her lover, it was a map of the castle's secret passages. In the 1170s, the women took it a step further. They established the courts of love. These were formal legal proceedings where noblewomen sat as judges to rule on relationship disputes. One famous case asked, "Can a woman truly love her husband?" The verdict from the ladies' court was a tactical masterstroke. No. They argued that because marriage was a legal obligation, a forced contract, it could never be true love, which must be a free gift between equals. By defining true love as something that only happened outside of marriage, they effectively legalized their own emotional and sexual agency. They created a moral safe space where they could pursue their own desires without technically violating their legal marriage vows. They were the original relationship anarchists. But what happens when the game of hearts leads to a war of crowns? In our Tiep Theo part, we move from the moonlit gardens to the silk armory of the royal wardrobe. You'll meet the fashion generals, women who used fashion not just to look beautiful, but as a form of high-stakes political branding to crush their rivals. Chitantan, Chungta se longge blaije, Huan Tien he sin tai noidung. The masters of the heart prove that love has always been a sophisticated form of power. These women didn't just fall in love. They built a world where love was their sharpest weapon. They turned devotion into debt and desire into diplomacy. The next time you receive a text or look at a romantic post, remember the coded knots of the 12th century. They are the reason chivalry exists, not because men were inherently noble, but because women forced them to be. In part 10, we're exploring the fashion warfare again, but focusing on the psychological branding used by queens to bankrupt their enemies. But first, if you had to send a secret message today without a phone, would you use the language of knots or the coded embroidery? Let me know your spy strategy in the comments. And if you're ready to see the real game of hearts, hit that subscribe button. We are told that fashion is vanity, that an obsession with silk and jewels is the mark of a shallow, feminine mind. But in the 14th century, at the royal court of France, a dress was never just a dress. It was a manifesto. It was a weapon of psychological warfare. It was a power move so lethal that it could bankrupt a rival's reputation before they even reached the throne. Today, we enter the ruck, row, and ruthless world of the fashion generals. From the queen, who used 2,477 pearls to humiliate her enemies, to the duchess, who used Milanese sophistication to incite a witchcraft trial. Welcome to the original art of power branding. Imagine the year 1389. Isabeau of Bavaria is preparing for her grand entry into Paris. She isn't just a queen. She is a brand in need of immediate market dominance. She appeared in a gown so heavy with gold thread and jewels that she required 2 knights just to help her stand and walk. The inventory records from the Archives Nationales revealed the nuclear option of fashion. Exactly 2,477 pearls, hundreds of sapphires, and a fabric so rare it took Italian looms 2 years to weave. This wasn't vanity. This was financial intimidation. By wearing a literal kingdom on her back, Isabeau was sending a silent broadcast to the rebellious French dukes and the skeptical public. My resources are infinite. My family is ancient. To oppose me is to oppose the wealth of empires. She used visual dominance to establish her authority in a world where 90% of the population could not read. Her dress was a high-resolution 4K statement of her absolute right to rule. She was setting the price of entry to the royal circle so high that her rivals felt physically and economically diminished in her presence. But every fashion general has a rival. Enter Valentina Visconti, the Duchess of Orléans. Valentina brought with her something far more dangerous than raw gold: taste. Coming from Milan, the fashion capital of the world, Valentina pioneered a style called the Italian cut. While Isabeau was covered in heavy, clunky jewels, Valentina wore fitted sleeves, deep necklines, and a subtle use of black silk. Why was black silk a power move? Because in 1390, achieving a true deep black dye was incredibly expensive and required dozens of layers of high-quality pigment. It was the 14th century version of quiet luxury. It made Isabeau's gold-covered dresses look like new money, desperate for attention. The court became a psychological battlefield. Isabeau struck back using the ultimate weapon, the sumptuary laws. These were legal codes that dictated exactly what you could wear based on your social rank. Isabeau influenced the king to pass laws specifically designed to bankrupt Valentina's wardrobe. She made it illegal for anyone except the queen to use specific types of ermine fur or certain heights of headwear. But when the law failed, Isabeau turned to social assassination. When the king began to suffer from bouts of madness, Isabeau started a whisper campaign. She claimed that Valentina's dresses weren't just beautiful, they were enchanted. She argued that the Milanese silks were woven with spells to steal the king's mind. The fashion war ended in a catastrophe for Valentina. The most stylish woman in France was accused of witchcraft, her wardrobe was confiscated, and she was exiled from Paris. Isabeau didn't need a dagger. She used a silk thread to garrote her rival's social existence. But the most aggressive fashion move of the Middle Ages was the hennin. You've seen them in storybooks. The tall, pointed hats that look like wizard hats. But in the 15th century, they were the power suits of the female elite. These hats grew to be 3 feet tall. They were architectural statements designed for spatial dominance. Think about the psychology. A woman in a 3-foot-tall hennin commanded the airspace of any room she entered. She forced everyone, including the men, to look up at her. She occupied more physical space than any man at the table. It was an undeniable visual manifestation of her social elevation. When Isabella of Portugal attended a diplomatic summit, her hennin was so tall that the palace doors had to be physically heightened for her to pass. This wasn't a fashion fail. It was a dominance play. She was telling the diplomats, "If you want me in the room, you must change your architecture to fit me." Behind every fashion general was a secret army, the master embroiderers. In 14th century Paris, these were almost entirely women. They were the creative directors of the era. They understood coded branding. They would embroider secret symbols into the hems and sleeves of dresses, a specific flower, a particular knot, or a hidden heraldic animal. To a man, it was just a pattern. To another woman, it was a social LinkedIn profile. It communicated political alliances, hidden wealth, and family loyalty. They were the original masters of the hidden signal. They also used gift diplomacy. A queen would gift an embroidered veil to a rival's daughter. It looked like a gesture of friendship, but the symbols Theo on the veil were a reminder of who held the real economic power. It was a Trojan horse of branding, delivered in a box of silk. But what happens when the branding is so successful, it becomes a threat to the state's finances? In our next part, we move from the catwalk to the shadow economy. You'll meet the financial masterminds, women who built a secret banking system to fund their wardrobes, their wars, and their children's futures, while the men were busy going bankrupt on the crusades. You'll learn how they used liquid assets like jewelry to move millions across borders without a single man knowing. The fashion generals proved that appearance was never just appearance. It was a sophisticated system of psychological warfare, nonverbal communication, and political branding. Isabeau and Valentina didn't just follow trends, they enforced them as weapons. They understood that in the game of power, if you do not control the visual narrative, your enemies will do it for you. So, if you were at the French court in 1390, would you choose Isabeau's pearl armor for total dominance, or Valentina's Milanese black silk for subtle, dangerous sophistication? Tell me your power brand in the comments. And if you're ready to see the real money behind the silk, hit that subscribe button. In the 14th century, a woman officially owned nothing. Under the law of coverture, her dowry, her inheritance, even the clothes on her back belonged to her husband. But if you looked into the secret compartments of a merchant's wife's jewelry box, you wouldn't find vanity. You would find a hedge fund. While kings were begging for high-interest loans from Italian bankers, a silent army of women was running a multi-million-dollar underground credit union. They didn't just save money, they laundered power through silk, pearls, and liquid gold. Today, we uncover the financial masterminds of the Middle Ages. These were the women who essentially invented modern venture capital from their private chambers. To a man in 1350, a woman's jewelry was just adornment. To a woman, it was a collateralized asset. Because liquid cash was easily seized by tax collectors or greedy male relatives, medieval women invested their wealth in portable assets. A heavy gold chain or a brooch encrusted with sapphires served as a 14th century offshore account. These items were highly standardized in value across Europe. A woman could take a ruby ring from London to Paris and liquidate it at a local goldsmith for immediate cash to fund a business deal or hire a lawyer. This was money laundering at its finest. By converting land or grain into jewelry, they moved their wealth into a shadow space that male-led courts simply couldn't track. But individual wealth was just the beginning. The real power lay in the beguine financial networks. The beguines, visual. A woman in dark robes, holding a thick ledger, character guide, were the freelancers of the Middle Ages. They chose not to marry, maintaining their legal status as femmes seules, individuals who could sign binding contracts. They turned their communal houses into shadow banks. Records from Flanders show beguine houses managing investment portfolios for local widows. They would pool thousands of small nest eggs to provide massive loans for the international cloth trade. They were essentially the first crowdfunders. They bypassed male-only banks and created a circular economy, female capital funding female growth, entirely bypassing the male-dominated banking monopoly. Meet Alice de Brienne, the financial strategist. Her household accounts from 1412 are a masterpiece of coded accounting. Alice didn't just record income. She practiced double-entry bookkeeping combined with secret symbols. A specific embroidery pattern on a receipt might signify a bill of exchange, a primitive form of a check that could be redeemed in Flanders. She used her shipping fleet to move this shadow capital across borders. While the English king was desperate for cash to fund the 100 Years' War, Alice was quietly moving thousands of gold florins to support female-led guilds in Italy. She understood risk diversification 500 years before it became a Wall Street buzzword. But what happened when a man, or even the crown, refused to pay back a shadow loan? This is where the financial masterminds became lethal. Meet Rose de Burford, a legendary wool merchant in 14th century London. In 1318, she had invested a fortune, thousands of gold florins, to fund a massive shipment of wool for the royal court. But when the time came for repayment, the royal treasury went silent. King Edward II thought he could ignore a widow. He was wrong. Rose didn't send soldiers, she sent legal notices. But more importantly, she triggered a credit blockade. She sent coded messages through her network of alewives and mercers. Suddenly, the royal court found itself unable to buy silk for the queen's coronation. The wine merchants refused to deliver to the palace. The very fabric of royal luxury began to unravel because Rose had cut off their informal credit. But the final blow was her public liquidation. Rose walked into the exchequer, the king's high court of finance, and laid down her tallies, notched wooden sticks used as receipts. She didn't just ask for her money. She sued for damages for lost opportunity. She argued that by withholding her capital, the king had prevented her from investing in a new Flemish textile venture. The court was paralyzed. If they ruled against her, every merchant in London would stop lending to the king. To save the national economy, the king was forced to grant Rose a special license to export wool tax-free for years until her debt, plus interest, was paid in full. Rose didn't just get her money back. She became a tax-exempt monopoly. But there was one place where even money couldn't always buy safety: the Inquisition. In our next part, we move from the secret financial chambers to the clandestine universities. You'll meet the rebel scholars, nuns who were conducting forbidden scientific experiments and preserving human knowledge while the world outside was busy burning it. The financial masterminds prove that money has always been the ultimate disruptor. These women understood that true independence isn't a gift, it's an asset. They built a parallel world where they were the bankers, the investors, and the ultimate enforcers. So, who would you fear more? A knight with a sword? Or a widow with your unpaid debt in her ledger? Let me know in the comments. And if you're ready to see the real power behind the history, hit that subscribe button. Imagine a world where 90% of the population is illiterate. A world where a single book is worth more than a manor house. Now, imagine a place where women are the only ones allowed to read, write, and conduct advanced scientific experiments. It wasn't a secret island, it was the convent. For centuries, we've been told that medieval nuns were silent, submissive women escaping the world. But the archives of the Vatican and the British Library tell a different story. These were the clandestine universities. These were the women who saved civilization while the men were busy destroying it. Today, we meet the rebel scholars. In the 12th century, if you wanted the highest level of education as a woman, you didn't go to a university, you went to a scriptorium. While the new universities of Paris and Oxford were explicitly banning women, convents like Rupertsberg and Gandesheim were becoming intellectual powerhouses. Meet Hildegard of Bingen, character guide, dark monastic robes, holding a quill and a thick parchment. Hildegard wasn't just a nun. She was a polymath. She was a composer, a philosopher, and a biologist. In her secret laboratory, she conducted what we'd recognize today as clinical trials. She tested botanical extracts on patients and recorded the results in her scientific journal, Physica. But the most incredible part? She developed a theory of cosmology that predicted the movement of the stars and the elements of the Earth centuries before the scientific revolution. She used her visions as a legal shield, telling the Pope that her scientific discoveries came directly from God. It was the ultimate intellectual loophole. If God told her the Earth was a sphere, who was a bishop to say she was wrong? But Hildegard wasn't alone. Convents across Europe were acting as the world's data centers. When the barbarian invasions and political chaos destroyed the great libraries of Rome and Greece, it was the female scriptoriums that took the fragments and copied them. Historians estimate that 70% of the classical texts, from Plato to Cicero, that survived into the Renaissance did so because of the labor of anonymous nuns. They weren't just mindlessly copying, they were annotating. In the margins of manuscripts from the 10th century, we find the secret dialogue of women. They would add their own scientific observations, challenge male translations of Greek philosophy, and even leave coded instructions for other female scholars in other convents. They created a peer review system that functioned entirely within the convent walls. They were the original open source developers of human knowledge. But knowledge isn't just science, it's culture. Enter Roswitha of Gandesheim. In a time when the church was trying to ban theater as sinful, Roswitha was writing scandalous, high-octane plays inside her cell. Her plays featured cross-dressing heroes, passionate love affairs, and women outsmarting Roman emperors. She used the Trojan horse strategy. She told the church her plays were teaching moral lessons. But if you look at the scripts, they are masterpieces of subversive feminism. She portrayed women as the intellectual superiors of men, using logic and wit to defeat tyrants. Her plays were performed in secret across the convent networks of Germany, creating a counterculture that the male bishops couldn't suppress because they didn't even know it existed. But what happens when the bright ages of the convent meet the Inquisition of the rising male universities? As we approach the 15th century, the male-dominated university system began to see the convents as a threat to their monopoly on knowledge. They started passing laws to restrict unauthorized female learning. They claimed that a woman's brain was too fragile for complex mathematics or philosophy. The nuns' response? They didn't stop. They encrypted. They began hiding their scientific and philosophical discoveries inside prayer books. They used a technique called micro-writing and secret ciphers. A book that looked like a simple collection of psalms to a male inspector might actually contain a revolutionary treatise on astronomy or anatomy. They were the original encrypted scholars, ensuring that the flame of knowledge was passed down through a secret sisterhood. The rebel scholars proved that the Dark Ages were only dark for those who weren't allowed inside the convent library. These women were the bridge between the ancient world and our modern science. They didn't just preserve the fire, they fanned it into a flame that would eventually light up the Renaissance. The next time you read a classic text or look at a star chart, remember the silent universities behind the stone walls. In our next part, we leave the cloister and enter the most dangerous battlefield of all, the royal chambers, you'll meet the political kingmakers, women who used marriage, motherhood, and sheer cunning to control the destiny of entire nations, while the kings were merely puppets. But first, if you were a medieval woman, would you choose the intellectual freedom of the convent or the dangerous power of the court? Let me know in the comments. And if you're ready to see how women really ran the world, hit that subscribe button. We are taught that the Middle Ages was a world of kings. We see their faces on coins, their names in the titles of wars, and their statues in the cathedrals. But if you look closer at the actual signatures on the royal decrees, the ones that moved armies, raised taxes, and settled peace treaties, you'll find a different name. For nearly 300 years, Europe was managed by a silent board of directors, a group of women who understood that a crown is just a piece of metal, but power, real power, is the ability to control the narrative. Today, we meet the political kingmakers, from the regent who outmaneuvered every duke in France to the empress who fought a 15-year civil war for her right to rule. Imagine the year 1226. The King of France is dead. The heir, Louis IX, is only 12 years old. The powerful dukes of France are circling like vultures, ready to tear the kingdom apart and seize the young boy's throne. They thought they were facing a grieving widow. They were facing Blanche of Castile. Blanche didn't just act as regent. She seized the machinery of state. While the dukes were raising armies, Blanche was raising alliances. She used her personal fortune, remember the shadow economy from episode 11, to buy the loyalty of the lower nobility. She reorganized the royal treasury and, most importantly, she took the young king to his coronation immediately, proving that the crown was not vacant. When the dukes finally attacked, Blanche didn't hide. She led the army herself. She wasn't just a mother protecting a son. She was a sovereign protecting an empire. She ruled France with an iron fist for decades, even after Louis came of age. Every major law that made France the dominant power of the 13th century has her fingerprints on it. But what happens when the law says you cannot rule? You change the law. Meet Empress Matilda. In 1135, her father, King Henry I of England, died. He had made all his barons swear an oath to support Matilda as his heir. But the moment he was gone, they broke their word and crowned her cousin, Stephen, instead. They thought a woman couldn't lead a war. They were wrong. Matilda launched a 15-year period of conflict known as the Anarchy. She didn't fight for a husband or a son. She fought for her own writ of right. Matilda was a master of political endurance. She survived sieges in the dead of winter, famously escaping Oxford Castle by dressing in white and sneaking through the snow. She managed her own mints, issued her own coins, and commanded her own knights. She proved that political legitimacy wasn't a gift from the barons. It was something you seized and held through sheer, bloody-minded persistence. She never wore the crown of England, but she ensured her son, Henry II, did. She didn't lose the war. She outlasted the opposition. The real secret of the kingmakers wasn't just war. It was dynastic engineering. Women like Eleanor of Aquitaine understood that a well-placed marriage was more effective than 1,000 catapults. Eleanor didn't just have children. She placed them on every throne in Europe. She was the grandmother of Europe. From her base in Aquitaine, she operated a diplomatic intelligence agency. She knew the personal weaknesses of every king, the financial debts of every duke, and the secret ambitions of every bishop. She used this information to negotiate treaties that favored her lands. When her son, Richard the Lionheart, was captured during the Crusades, it wasn't the English government that saved him. It was Eleanor's personal negotiation with the Holy Roman Emperor and her massive fundraising campaign. She was the prime minister of a family empire that spanned from Scotland to Jerusalem. But how did they maintain control in a world that wanted to silence them? They used the seal. In the Middle Ages, a royal seal was the equivalent of a digital signature. We have found thousands of charters and legal documents from the 12th and 13th centuries where the Queen's seal is either equal to or larger than the King's. They were the ones managing the chancery, the department of letter writing and lawmaking. While the kings were away hunting or fighting, the queens were at the desk issuing letters patent, granting lands, and settling legal disputes. They were the administrative heart of the kingdom. They proved that while the king might be the face of the state, the queen was its operating system. The political kingmakers proved that the Middle Ages were not ruled by men alone. They were ruled by those who understood the law, the money, and the power of the bloodline. These women didn't just support power, they were power. The next time you see a statue of a medieval king, look for the woman standing just behind him in the shadows. She's the one holding the quill. In our next part, we move from the game of crowns to the most intimate battlefield of all, motherhood and survival. You'll meet the mothers who faced the Black Death and made impossible choices to ensure the future of their lines. But first, if you were a medieval queen, would you rather rule as a regent like Blanche or fight for your own crown like Matilda? Let me know your strategy in the comments. And if you're ready to see the real Game of Thrones, hit that subscribe button. In the winter of 1348, the world ended. The Black Death didn't care about your titles, your gold, or your secret banking networks. It only cared about skin and breath. But inside the dying houses of Europe, a silent war was being fought. A war of love versus mercy. Imagine being a mother and realizing that the fever in your child's eyes is a death sentence. Imagine knowing that the doctors have no cure and the church has only prayers for the dead. Today, we enter the most heartbreaking chapter of our series. This is the story of the survival mothers. These were the women who made impossible choices to protect their bloodlines, even when it meant breaking their own hearts. When the plague hit, the official medical world, the men we met in episode 4, fled to the countryside. But the women stayed. They were the original frontline workers. Medieval mothers like Agnes de Montfort became accidental scientists. While the world was screaming about divine punishment, these women were observing transmission. They noticed that houses with clean water and fresh herbs fared better. They practiced domestic quarantine centuries before it was a public health term. They used vinegar and thyme to wash the skin and burned juniper to cleanse the air. It wasn't magic. It was an intuitive understanding of antisepsis. They were the ones who maintained the records of who lived and who died, creating the first epidemiological maps in their personal diaries. They were the only thing standing between their families and total extinction. But sometimes, science failed. And that's where the impossible choices began. The Black Death was a slow, agonizing way to die. It involved painful swellings, internal bleeding, and a fever that turned the mind to ash. In the archives of the Abbey of St. Anne, we found a haunting record from 1349. A woman named Bertha confessed to a sin that the church couldn't define. Her 3 children were covered in buboes. She knew they had days of screaming agony ahead. So, she prepared a sleep from crushed poppy and hemlock, the botanical knowledge of Trotula, and gave it to them in their warm milk. She held them as they drifted from sleep into death, painlessly. Was she a murderer? To the medieval legal system, perhaps. But to her, it was the ultimate act of maternal sacrifice. She chose to carry the guilt of their deaths so they wouldn't have to carry the weight of the plague's torture. For the mothers who survived, the battle wasn't over. They had to ensure the future. Women like Isabella de Fortibus used the chaos of the plague to secure their children's inheritance. With so many men dead, the wardship laws were in tatters. Isabella spent her personal fortune, her shadow assets, to bribe royal officials to recognize her children's claims to land that was technically ownerless. They practiced relentless succession. If one child died, they immediately moved to secure the rights of the next in line. They were the guardians of the family tree in a forest that was being cut down by the scythe of death. They proved that motherhood was not just a biological state, it was a political mission. But how did they recover? How did they rebuild a world that had lost 50% of its people? They used the community of widows. After 1350, Europe was a continent of widows. These women didn't just mourn, they consolidated. They married each other's survivors, pooled their lands, and created new family structures. They were the ones who restarted the farms and the workshops. They proved that while the men were the heads of the households, the women were the roots. The survival mothers remind us that the greatest power is not the ability to kill, but the courage to protect, and the wisdom to know when to let go. They navigated the darkest time in human history with nothing but their wits and their love. The next time you look at your family tree, remember the women of 1348. They are the reason you are here today. In our final part, we move to the grand legacy. You'll see how all these threads, the money, the law, the science, and the blood, came together to create the world we live in today. But first, knowing the horror of the plague, do you think Bertha's choice was an act of murder or an act of supreme love? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. And if you're ready to see the end of our journey, hit that subscribe button. We are told that progress is a straight line, that we started in the mud of the Dark Ages, where women were property, and slowly, painfully, fought our way into the light of the 21st century. That is the biggest lie ever told. History is not a line, it's a cycle. And today, we've reached the center of that circle. We've seen the CEO of ships, the medicine queens, the law warriors, and the shadow bankers. We've seen that the Middle Ages weren't dark, they were occupied. Today, we reclaim the grand legacy. It's time to realize that the world you live in was built by the women they tried to erase. Let's talk about the Magna Carta. Every law school in the US and the UK teaches that it's the foundation of modern democracy, granted by King John in 1215. But who taught King John about the writ of right? Who established the legal precedents for property autonomy and due process 40 years before the barons ever drew their swords? It was Eleanor of Aquitaine. In her territories, Eleanor established a legal system where individuals had rights that even a sovereign had to respect. She pioneered the concept of the independent legal entity. When you exercise your right to due process today, you are walking in the footsteps of a 12th century queen who refused to be a puppet. The DNA of our modern legal system isn't just great men. It's the strategic brilliance of women who use the law to protect their bloodlines and their business. Look at Wall Street. Look at our global banking systems. We've seen in how the big one financial networks and the shadow masterminds like Alice de Brienne essentially invented venture capital and short selling. They proved that liquidity is more powerful than titles. They created the informal economy that allowed Europe to survive when the kings were going bankrupt. Every time a woman today manages her own investment portfolio or launches a startup through crowdfunding, she is using the tools forged by the alewives and the silk merchants of the 1300s. They were the original disruptors who proved that if you control the gold, you control the game. When we look at modern medicine, we see a male-dominated past. But we've uncovered the clandestine universities. Trotula of Salerno and Hildegard of Bingen weren't lucky amateurs. They were scientists who understood antisepsis, anesthesia, and dermatology centuries before the founding fathers of modern medicine were even born. The only reason they were called witches was because their science was a threat to a male-led monopoly. When we reclaim Trotula, we aren't just adding a name to a textbook. We are acknowledging that the female mind has always been at the cutting edge of human discovery. We are restoring the intellectual lineage that was stolen from us. Why did they try to hide this? Because power is maintained by making people believe they have never had it. By convincing women that they were always oppressed, the system ensured they wouldn't look back and see their own strength. But the archives are speaking. The coded ledgers are being decrypted. The silent empire is no longer silent. Medieval women faced the Black Death, the Inquisition, and the sumptuary laws. And they didn't just survive, they thrived. They built shadow networks, they commanded armies, and they governed empires from the shadows. They taught us that resistance is a skill and agency is a choice. This journey of 30,000 words ends here, but your part begins now. We aren't giving women power today. We are returning it. We aren't achieving new heights. We are reoccupying the peaks our ancestors already conquered. The Middle Ages were not a time of female fragility. They were a time of female fortitude. The next time you hear someone talk about the Dark Ages, correct them. Tell them about Alice. Tell them about Matilda. Tell them about the alewives and the rebel scholars. Tell them that the empire was never lost. It was just waiting for us to remember its name. This is the end of our series, but the beginning of a new history. Which of these 15 chapters changed your world the most? Was it the shadow banking, the battlefield lions, or the secret science? Drop your final thoughts in the comments. Let's start a conversation that history can no longer ignore. If you've been with us since Tap 1, thank you for being a part of this reclamation. Hit that subscribe button, share this series, and let the world know the empire has awakened.